Dr. Kelly, I can't tell y'all how fortunate we are to have Dr. Kelly agree to join us. I feel like I know her personally, although we've never actually met. But she has really been a cornerstone and the foundation as South Carolina moves through this pandemic. Dr. Kelly is a board certified in internal medicine, but more importantly, she knows us. She's been at Franklin C. Fetter. Many of y'all know that's at FQHC in Charleston. She's been with the Indian Health Service. She has 36 years of experience in public health all over, international, local, the CDC. So let me tell you, we got the top gun here. So y'all welcome Dr. Kelly. You may have seen her before on many of our podcasts, but take her away, Dr. Kelly.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction. It is true. My first job out of internship and residency was working at Fetter, and I learned a tremendous amount working with resource limited settings. I'll tell you, it was the mid 80s. It was the early days of HIV. We didn't have treatment. I thought HIV was going to be the defining infectious disease of my career, and then COVID has hit. So we've got a lot of ground to cover this morning, and so let's go ahead and take it away. This is the epi curve for South Carolina, the state of the state, where you can see the number of new cases per day, as well as that green line, which is a moving 7-day average. I hope that we are experiencing a downturn that will stay in COVID-19 cases per day, but I think we need to not become too complacent about that. We had very low numbers in May and June, fewer than 100 new cases a day. And then we had a surge where we were having the same number of new cases per day as what we were seeing in January. So we still need to continue to embrace all those mitigation measures around masking, vaccinating, avoiding crowded indoor settings. And we're going to talk about some of those measures today. Also going to talk about a number of myths. And among those myths are that, that vaccine developed this fast can't be safe and effective, or that the mRNA vaccines are too new, or the E in EUA means experimental. Also debunk the myth about vaccination being more dangerous than COVID disease, or that breakthrough cases mean vaccine doesn't work, or that boosters mean vaccine doesn't work. We'll talk about monoclonal antibodies, and if you get monoclonal antibodies, should you get vaccinated? Do you need vaccination? What if you had prior infection? Do you need to get vaccinated? We'll talk a bit about fertility and menstrual periods. What evidence do we have? And we'll finish up with masks. Do they work or not? So we're going to do a little bit of Mythbusters, and sprinkled in between, I hope I will cover a lot of the questions you asked. I think first, to really understand vaccine and the other treatments for COVID-19, we need to step back a little to basic biology and terminology. So SARS-CoV-2, that's the name of the virus that causes COVID-19, the name of the disease. I've got a little cartoon on the right-hand side of this slide showing what the virus looks like under the microscope. The squiggly line in the center, that's its genetic code. This virus has RNA. We have DNA as our genetic code, our genes. This virus has RNA, a related but different compound, and it's coded by a protein coat that includes one protein in particular I want to mention, the spike protein. This one is important because that is the protein that attaches the virus to the cell and injects the genes for the virus into the cell. So just a little visual depiction of this is what's happening at the cellular level. The virus enters your respiratory system, attaches to a particular receptor on the surface of the cell, which you can see up in the upper left-hand corner, and then actually opens the cell membrane so that the virus gets into the cell. The virus takes over some of the protein machinery of the cell to make more copies of itself, and then in the upper right-hand corner, releases additional virus particles to go infect other cells. You all know the symptoms of for most cases of COVID-19. They're mild to moderate, fever, cough. Some people have breathing difficulties, aching all over. There are some other strange symptoms like the loss of taste or smell. For most people, COVID-19 is mild to moderate, and they are not hospitalized. Unfortunately, in some people, COVID-19 doesn't just affect the respiratory system. It can affect your heart. It can cause damage to your kidneys, your liver, your gut, your brain. It can cause serious disease in women who are pregnant, causing harm both to that woman and to the unborn child. And unfortunately, some people end up in the hospital, in the intensive care unit, on IV medications, sometimes on a ventilator breathed for them. This is a screenshot from the Medical University of South Carolina in Charleston and the other children's hospitals collaborative. They monitor how many children are hospitalized in critical care and on a ventilator. And not just Medical University, I misspoke. This is a collaborative of all the children's specific hospitals in the state. The purple circles are children who are unvaccinated and older than 12 years of age, meaning they could have been vaccinated. The yellow ones, they're kids who are unvaccinated, but they're under 12. We don't have a vaccine for kids under 12 just yet. But it is really tragic to see the large number of purple dots there, both hospitalized, in critical care, and on a ventilator, because those were vaccine preventable illnesses. If those kids had been vaccinated, it's highly unlikely that they would be in the hospital. So let's talk about how vaccines work. A number of people have a misconception. This is not how vaccines work, but I think a lot of times people think if you're vaccinated that there's like a shield or a magic bubble around you and that the virus particles bounce off it and you can't get infected. If you're vaccinated, the vaccine protects you from getting severe disease, but it doesn't protect you from the virus particles getting in your system. What vaccines do is they provide a sneak preview for your immune system. I like this silly little cartoon. It's showing a wanted poster on the wall with a picture of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, and the angry looking white blood cells, that's part of the immune system, recognize right away that 2 virus particles have entered the respiratory system. So they know to attack right away. They're ready. They've already made antibodies. They have memory, and they attack those virus particles. So if anyone is exposed to SARS-CoV-2, they're exposed through their respiratory system, through the nose, mouth, or even through the eyes. Virus can enter through your eye mucous membranes. And so that virus particles can enter your system, whether you're vaccinated or not. But what happens next depends upon whether you're vaccinated. If you have no vaccine and no prior infection, you're not immune, the virus can easily get into your respiratory system cells by attaching with that spike protein and getting in. If you're vaccinated, you're immune to the virus. What does that mean? Well, as soon as that virus enters your system, antibodies attach to it. It's gobbled up by these other immune system cells called phagocytes, and a number of other things happen. So you're much less likely to have any virus particles enter your respiratory cells. Some might get in, but most do not, and it prevents progression to severe disease. You know, I want to remind folks that we live in a remarkable era with vaccine preventable diseases. It is not that long ago that we were having, in some cases, hundreds of thousands of people experiencing disease with diphtheria, with measles, with pertussis, which is whooping cough, and a bunch of other diseases, as you can see. And in this particular chart, as compared to the year 2004 or 5, we had 0 cases of diphtheria, and remarkably fewer cases of many other diseases. So vaccines are a really important tool in our armamentarium. All right, we've got a lot of myths to go through. So let's start with that first one. How could it possibly be safe and effective when it was developed so quickly? There are 3 basic steps to developing any vaccine, not just a coronavirus vaccine. Basic science research, testing it in animals for safety and effectiveness, and only then do you start testing it in humans. Far and away, the longest step in development of a vaccine is that basic science research. So when did that basic science research start for SARS-CoV-2? Did it start in January of 2020 when the virus was first discovered and described by the Chinese? No. Do you remember the original SARS, severe acute respiratory syndrome? This was SARS-CoV-1. This was the year 2003. Research on the SARS-CoV viruses started in 2003. This was a pandemic also. About 8,000 people were infected around the world. About 800 died. It was highly lethal, but fortunately it wasn't as contagious. So they were able to quarantine folks and able to contain that particular pandemic. And we haven't heard from SARS-CoV-1 since. However, they knew that this was a serious virus, and work started then and there on understanding more about this virus. How does it get into its cells? What are going to be the weak points? What do we know about its biochemistry? What can we do for developing a vaccine if it comes back in a mutated form, as it did? SARS-CoV-2 is very closely related to this original SARS. So how were they able to get it into human studies so quickly? Well, remember SARS-CoV-1, they figured out its genetic code. Then they looked at the genetic code for SARS-CoV-2, found which points were different, and decided we need to attack this thing at its entry point. We need to make a vaccine specifically to that spike protein. They were able to make a vaccine to the spike protein and get it into animals as early as February of 2020. When it was proven safe and effective in animals, including monkeys, they decided, okay, now we can start with human studies. Phase 1 studies, you try the vaccine out in young, healthy persons, just to see if there are any safety concerns. If there are no safety concerns, you go to phase 2, a couple of hundred people. Again, looking for safety, looking for immune response, also trying to figure out, can we do this as 1 shot or 2? And if it is safe and effective in that group, you go on to phase 3 studies. Now it's phase 3 studies where this vaccine was treated differently from other vaccines. It's true that other vaccines have usually take years to develop. The measles vaccine took 4 years to develop. That was really our second fastest development of a vaccine. What was different here for the SARS-CoV-2 vaccines is that phase 3 studies, they usually do them in small steps. Phase 3 studies, human studies are expensive. And so companies don't want to invest in them until they know they're pretty sure they've got a good thing. So usually they'll do a study in maybe 300, 500 people, look at it over a few months. If the results look good, then they'll do another 300, 500 people. If the results look good, they'll do another group. That's why it takes years. What was different here is that the US government, other international governments, philanthropic organizations said to the vaccine companies, we will invest. Do not drag this out over years. Go ahead and recruit tens of thousands of people right from the very beginning. Do it overlapping. Don't do it in those baby steps. And in fact, Pfizer and Moderna, the first two out of the gate, they were able to recruit over 40,000 people each in study sites around the world in just 2 months, in June and July of 2020. That's unprecedented. No steps were skipped. It wasn't sped up. It was overlapping, that they did so many people at the same time. There are a lot of different ways to make a vaccine. And these vaccines, Pfizer, Moderna, and the Janssen or J&J vaccine, are all done by making them a DNA or an RNA vaccine. Now, that's not the first time that's ever been done. It's the first time it's done in this country, but we have other vaccines to MERS, which is Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, another related virus, to Zika, to West Nile, to Ebola, that use these technologies as well. So mRNA vaccine is new in this country, but I just want people to understand it's not brand new, like 2020 new. In fact, vaccine developers have been working on this technology for years. This is a really busy slide. I'm not going to go through everything. I want to point out, it may be that most people haven't heard of mRNA or messenger RNA, but it was actually discovered back in 1961. And scientists for years have been working to use this gene as a way to treat people who have hormone deficiencies or to treat people with cancer. And in fact, in 2009, scientists started using immunotherapy, meaning using your immune system to fight cancer using messenger RNA to attack cancer cells. People think about the immune system and infections, but in fact, the immune system also does surveillance looking for abnormal cells like cancer. So mRNA it feels very new, but it has an older history than you might realize. And if you're interested in learning more, MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, has a free YouTube series. I chose this one in particular. The series is about SARS-CoV-2, but this particular one, Lecture 10, is on vaccines. It's presented by Dr. Corbett from NIH, who specifically worked on the NIH aspect of the Moderna vaccine. So let's go back to those steps in a coronavirus vaccine. How come Pfizer is fully FDA approved and the others are still in an EUA? And how come ages 12 through 15 are still under an EUA? What's the difference between an EUA and full approval? The difference is in the number of months of follow-up. So they both, for an emergency use authorization and for full approval, they both require the same number of scientific studies, same number of people giving evidence around safety and efficacy or effectiveness. Does the vaccine work? For an emergency use authorization, you need a minimum of 2 months of safety follow-up of those people who were in the phase 3 study. Now, 2 months doesn't sound like a very long time. How did they come up with that number? It's not arbitrary. They come up with that amount of time based on what we've seen with other vaccines. We've had other vaccines in this country for more than 100 years, many different vaccines in the past 50 years. Our experience with that is that most people, if they're going to have an adverse event like Guillain-Barré syndrome or Bell's palsy or an allergic reaction, it happens within the first 6 weeks. So they felt 2 months worth of safety data was enough to go forward. And if they had waited to get full approval, think about how many more hundreds of thousands of people would have died of COVID-19. So what is full approval? Full approval, you have to have a minimum of 6 months worth of safety data, plus that you gather data from the people who received the vaccine under the EUA. So in fact, Pfizer, Moderna, Janssen, they all have large numbers of people who've received the vaccine and they have that data. But who was available? Which vaccine was available first? Pfizer. So they've had the data for the longest. So that's why they were the first ones to be able to submit their application for full approval. Moderna has submitted their application for full approval. FDA is looking at it right now. I'm pretty confident they're going to get full approval as well. Janssen, far fewer doses of that vaccine were given. So it's going to be a while before we hear from them. But again, I feel pretty confident they will get full approval. So how do these vaccines work? Remember the virus with that spike protein. None of these vaccines have whole virus, COVID-19 virus in them. They cannot give you COVID-19 disease. All of these vaccines only have a gene. The messenger RNA carries the message for making the spike protein. It's made into a vaccine, injected in the muscle. Your immune system responds by making some spike proteins from that messenger RNA and making the antibodies specific to it. And not just antibodies, there are other things in your immune system. There are memory cells, there are killer T cells, lots of other cells as well. But let's focus on the antibodies at first, because they're the first ones on the scene. These are the common ingredients in the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. They both have messenger RNA, that's the active ingredient, the gene for the spike protein. The other ingredients are inactive ingredients that coat the messenger RNA, so it's not destroyed by enzymes in the muscle before it has a chance to get into the immune cells. Those other ingredients are salts, sugars, other lipids or oils. There's one in particular called polyethylene glycol. It's a lipid that is probably the cause of an allergic reaction for people who are allergic. This is not ethylene glycol. This is not antifreeze. This is polyethylene glycol. It is a common ingredient in over-the-counter laxatives like Colace. These vaccines do not have any antibiotics, egg, preservative, mercury, aluminum, adjuvant. This is all the ingredients in these vaccines. Pfizer and Moderna in their studies showed that they were proved to have 95% protection against symptomatic disease 2 weeks after the second shot. You have to get both shots to get that full benefit. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine was developed as a single dose vaccine. They are doing studies right now to see, would you get even stronger protection with a second dose? And the preliminary results show, yep, you probably would get stronger protection with a booster dose, but it is available as a single dose for people who want something that is one and done. And it does provide 85% protection against severe disease after just one shot. And it's high protection against hospitalization after just one shot. So for each of us, you have to weigh the benefits and risks to every decision you make in life. This is no different. We know vaccines are highly effective. You have to weigh that against your personal risk. What's your risk of exposure to COVID-19? What's your risk if you get COVID-19 of having severe disease? Let's talk a little bit about breakthrough cases, because I know they have been in the news and people are concerned that, well, wait a minute, if I could get a breakthrough case even after I'm vaccinated, what good is getting vaccinated? What's good about getting vaccinated is preventing severe disease. This is a slide from July 2021 in South Carolina of the people who have been reported as cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. Far and away, most cases, hospitalizations, and deaths are among the unvaccinated. Those are those little black figures in here. What about those little red figures that were people who were vaccinated and yet nevertheless got COVID-19? Most of them had mild illness. Some of them were asymptomatic. They're people who are just getting tested routinely, weekly, for example, if they're hospital workers. Yes, there were 550 hospitalizations in July, and 23% of them were vaccinated, and there were some deaths. But who were those people? The average age for those breakthrough hospitalizations was 72, and the average age of breakthrough deaths was 80. Medical University of South Carolina reported that most of their hospitalizations of severe disease and death were people who were immunocompromised. And this is a quote from Dr. Goodwin at MUSC. That's a patient with an organ transplant who has to take immunosuppressants to prevent rejection. Vaccines do protect you against severe disease, hospitalization, and death. And in fact, breakthrough cases are rare. This is a slide shot from our breakthrough cases DHEC website that shows that among the total number of breakthrough cases, it's less than 0.4% of people who are vaccinated. We've had over 2 million people fully vaccinated in South Carolina. So to see 7,000, 8,000 breakthrough cases is no surprise. Nothing in life is 100%, but this is really remarkable in decreasing your risk of hospitalization or death. All right, what about immunocompromise and boosters? Right now, the only people for whom FDA has authorized a booster, a third dose of Pfizer vaccine, is for people who are immunocompromised. And by that, I mean people who are undergoing active cancer treatment. They're on cancer chemotherapy or radiation, not breast cancer 5 years ago, cancer treatment now. People who have organ transplants, people who are on immunosuppressive medications, including prednisone, 20 milligrams a day or more. Those are the people who need a third dose right now. And they need a third dose because their first two probably did not take as well, didn't give them as strong an immune response. What about boosters for everybody else? This is complicated because, again, you have to weigh risk and benefit. The benefit of initial vaccination, the first series of vaccines, clearly outweigh the risks. But what about a third dose? Does everybody really need a third dose? Is it worth, what's the risk benefit ratio? What's the additional benefit that you might get? That's exactly what FDA and the Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices are talking about right now. Many vaccines require boosters. This very busy slide is showing what the vaccine recommendations are for children on the top and for adults on the bottom. You can see, especially for kids, look at DTaP. You get 3 doses in the first 6 months of life, and then a booster at 15 to 18 months and a booster at 4 to 6 years. Boosters are common. They are a reminder to our immune system, don't forget about this particular bacteria or viruses. So don't let the concept of needing a booster put you off. But we might not need boosters for everyone, because how long does vaccine efficacy last? Well, we know for most people, at least 8 months. We've only had vaccine available for about 8 or 9 months. So it's going to take some time to really answer this question. It probably lasts longer for most people, highly effective in preventing severe disease. There is some information in the United States and out of Israel that it's less effective for people age 65 and up and for the immunocompromised. So FDA, ACIP, they're looking at the data right now. And I mean literally right now. They met yesterday and they're meeting again today. And hopefully they will answer the question also about if you got Moderna or the J&J, should you get a booster? We don't have that information yet. We want to make a data evidence-based decision, not just a best guess about that. So here are some of the sort of thing that they are debating. I put in this link so that you would have that if you want to look at more information about what evidence is ACIP looking at. This is the kind of stuff they're looking at, that they know there's a decline in vaccine efficacy for older adults, as well as for infection and for hospitalization. But for people younger than 65, there's good evidence the vaccines remain effective and that we might not need a third or booster dose. Well, what about children? I just saw in the news that Pfizer announced that their vaccine is safe and effective in children aged 5 through 11. Well, that is good news, but we haven't seen that data yet. That's just their announcement. We are hopeful that that is true. They still need to submit their application to the FDA. They have stated they plan to submit that by the end of September. Then FDA will review. And if their review takes about the same time as it has taken for ages 12 through 15, that's about 4 to 6 weeks. And then if they give their EUA or full approval, goes to, again, to ACIP, CDC for their recommendations. Bottom line is we expect that vaccine for kids 5 through 11 might be available as early as Halloween, probably more like early November. And what about vaccine for under age 5? Maybe by the end of the year, early 2022. They have to look at doses. Do you judge the dose on the child's age, by the weight, that sort of thing? And again, why is Pfizer fully approved and first with kids? They were simply first out of the gate. Pfizer and Moderna vaccines are very similar. The Janssen vaccine is a little bit different because it also uses what's called an adenovirus vector. That's like a common cold virus that has been weakened, and they use it as a delivery truck. They put the messenger RNA in that delivery truck of that weakened virus because that virus is very good at getting into cells. But otherwise, these vaccines are really pretty similar. I know there have been a number of questions about myocarditis, and this is exactly why those organizations are looking at, really, do we need booster doses? Really, do we need vaccine for kids 5 to 11 or 6 months to 5 years old? What is the risk of adverse events such as myocarditis? So let's focus on this a little bit. Myocarditis means an inflammation of the heart muscle. And that inflammation can come with a number of different things. You can get myocarditis from having an infection, by having myocarditis if you have influenza. Even a common cold can, in some people, cause an temporary inflammation of the heart muscle. COVID-19 vaccines have been associated with myocarditis. Fortunately, the numbers are low. Overall, it's about 16 cases per million doses of vaccine, and there have been 0 deaths from myocarditis associated with COVID vaccine. However, you still have to be concerned. Myocarditis, that sounds really serious. Most of these cases, as I said, have been mild. And unfortunately, we know that the incidence, the chance of myocarditis is higher among younger and higher among men. So there is some concern about risk-benefit ratio in younger children. That's why we don't want to vaccinate anybody 5 to 11 right now. Let the scientists look at the data to determine the risk-benefit ratio. What about long-term effects? If you have myocarditis, and right now we know myocarditis from COVID-19 vaccine has resolved in 95% of the cases that have experienced it. There are still some cases right now that have myocarditis and are being observed. What's our experience with other vaccines in myocarditis? Smallpox vaccine gave a rate of myocarditis also about 16 per million doses. Now, smallpox vaccine seems like ancient history, but remember, after 9/11, there was concern about bioterrorism, and military recruits were given smallpox vaccine by the millions, and a certain number of them also developed myocarditis. They've been studied now for more than 20 years to see, have they had any long-term effects? There's no higher incidence of heart disease among these military recruits when compared to others of the same gender, age, and other medical factors such as diabetes that could cause heart disease. Let's shift to another treatment for COVID-19 disease: monoclonal antibodies. When you get vaccinated, you make your own natural antibodies and you stimulate those other aspects of your immune system. If you're not vaccinated, or even if you are vaccinated, if you get COVID-19 and you're at risk for developing severe disease, maybe you're older, maybe you have multiple medical problems, maybe you are immunocompromised, you can get passive antibodies. These are antibodies that are made in a laboratory and put into an IV. So you can get an IV infusion of these antibodies, or you can, in some cases, get them as a series of subcutaneous shots. What this does is it gives you a temporary boost to your system by giving you these passive antibodies. But I don't want anybody to confuse this as a replacement for vaccine. These passive antibody treatments do help to prevent progression, 70% reduction in hospitalization and death, and they're available for almost everybody. Have to be at least 12 years old, weigh at least 88 pounds, high risk for severe illness, but that even includes being overweight with a body mass index of 25 or more. But remember, these are temporary. They last in your system only for about 3 months. They are not a substitute for vaccination. Yes, they're free, they're safe, highly effective, but the same is true for vaccine. And we have a monoclonal antibody shortage in this country right now. Don't rely on getting monoclonal antibodies. Don't think, oh, I don't need to get vaccinated. If I get COVID, I'll just go get those passive antibodies. The chance is they might not be available when you need them. It's better to get vaccinated first. If you get vaccinated, you can still get monoclonal antibodies if you need them, but the chance of you needing them is much lower. There was a question about which is better, remdesivir or monoclonal antibodies. They're different. They're very different treatment, and timing is critical. Monoclonal antibodies, which sometimes you see as a different abbreviation, they are outpatient only. For them to work, you need to give them in the first 10 days. If you wait until somebody is seriously ill, they will not help. It's too late. Remdesivir, though, that is for patients in the hospital with serious illness. That has a very different effect. It's important in serious illness. How about this question? Do I really need the COVID-19 vaccine if I already had COVID? It's true. If you already had COVID, that stimulated your immune system. You definitely have partial immunity. But if you already had COVID, you can still cut your risk of reinfection in half by getting vaccinated. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples. This is from a study from Kentucky that was published in August. They looked at people who had SARS-CoV-2 in May and June of 2020, and then looked at people who got reinfected a year later in May, June 2021, to those who didn't get reinfected. They found that the people who were not vaccinated, they had prior infection but not vaccinated, they were more than twice as likely to get reinfected than those who had prior infection and then got vaccinated. So vaccine does improve protection, even for people who were previously infected. And I do also want to point out that this study, this was done before Delta was the predominant variant. Infection with a different variant might not protect you against Delta as well, but vaccine will. What about the Israeli study? There are a number of studies coming out of Israel that are excellent. I do want to point out that a number of them are what's called preprints, which means they've not been reviewed by journal scientists yet. So some of their results, haven't been independently reviewed by other statisticians. So these results might change as they go through that peer review. But this study in particular, and I got a link to it on the slide, showed a number of important things. They found that, to my surprise, they found that people who were vaccinated with no prior infection had a higher risk for breakthrough infection with Delta compared to those previously infected. Well, I'm not surprised the previous infection provided some protection. We know that reinfection is rare within 90 days of prior infection. But I think there's another conclusion in this article that people often miss. It's a mistake to think that people with prior infection have no benefit from vaccination. They do. This study clearly showed that people who had prior infection doubled their protection, even if they just got a single dose of vaccine. So, people who had, the other important finding was that people who had neither prior infection nor vaccination, that's the group that was at higher risk of getting COVID. So what if you had COVID? When can you get vaccinated? We do know that reinfection is rare within 90 days of infection. So it might be reasonable to delay if you have been very recently infected, but you can get vaccinated as soon as you complete your isolation period of 10 days. Remember that Delta is more than 97% of the variants that are circulating in South Carolina. And CDC considers Delta the only one that is, quote, a variant of concern. And the reason it's considered a variant of concern is twofold. Definitely spreads faster, and there is some evidence that it may cause more serious illness in adults and children. All the other variants you're hearing about, Mu, Lambda, they are considered variants being monitored. They're a very small proportion of cases in the United States. There's no evidence that vaccines are not effective against them, but we're still monitoring them and doing studies to look at that specific question. Is there a test you can take to find out if you had COVID? Yes, the test is looking for antibodies, but specifically antibodies to the nucleocapsid of the virus. The problem with the antibody tests, or the challenge with the antibody test, is it doesn't tell you when you had COVID-19. And if it's been more than 90 days, we don't know the strength of your immunity. With infection, immunity varies a lot. If you had mild illness, you don't get as strong an immune response as if you had serious disease. Vaccines, on the other hand, they're at a consistent dose, and they're engineered to give you a very high level of immunity to the spike protein. There is an antibody test that looks specifically for antibodies to the spike protein that turns positive when you're vaccinated. So sorry for the confusion, but there are basically three kinds of antibody tests: one to the nucleocapsid, one to the spike protein, and there are some antibody tests that will look at both. What about this question of COVID vaccine and fertility? During the Pfizer vaccine studies, now of course they did not deliberately enroll any woman who was pregnant in their vaccine study. You never enroll pregnant women deliberately in those phase 3 studies, whether it's a vaccine or a medication. As it just so happens, 23 women volunteers became pregnant during that study, and no one who had the vaccine had an impact on their pregnancy. There was one pregnancy loss in the placebo group, but that's a very low number. So in the very beginning, all we could say was that we did not have any reason to think that vaccine would affect fertility. We had no reason to think it would affect pregnancy. Now we do have some data. But where did this rumor even come from? Well, in December 2020, when the Food and Drug Administration here in the United States was looking at Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, the same thing was going on in Europe. The European equivalent of the FDA received a letter from an ex-Pfizer employee and a physician claiming that the spike protein, remember the vaccine is to the spike protein, they claimed it's similar in structure to a protein in the placenta, and the vaccine would cause a woman, theoretically, to make antibodies to the placenta. There's no evidence that this is true. And there is good evidence now that the vaccine is safe in pregnancy. If COVID vaccine affected the placenta, if COVID vaccine interfered with fertility or interfered with pregnancy because it affected the placenta, you'd expect more miscarriages. This is a table of a study in the New England Journal of Medicine, and it involved over 35,000 women who either became pregnant and were vaccinated or were vaccinated shortly before they became pregnant. And they enrolled in this study called V-Safe, where they report to CDC. CDC checks up on them about how's your pregnancy going, what complications, and CDC follows them through to 6 months after delivery, looking for any complication of that pregnancy. In this table, they're reporting about what is called spontaneous abortion. That's the medical term for a miscarriage. After 20 weeks, that's called a stillbirth. The middle column here is what do we know by looking at historically over many years at what's the rate of miscarriage. It varies in different groups of people, depends upon where you live in the country, your access to care, other medical conditions, but it ranges from 10 to 26% of early pregnancies end in miscarriage. In the women who received the vaccine, only 12.6% of people had a miscarriage. I shouldn't say only, that's certainly a miscarriage is a tragedy, but it was not at a higher rate. There was no increase in miscarriage, stillbirth, premature birth, small babies, birth defects, or newborn death among women who were vaccinated. We have many years of data on miscarriages, and it varies also by the mother's age and what week of pregnancy she miscarried. So this is another study looking specifically at women before 20 weeks of pregnancy to look at rates of miscarriage. And again, the rate of miscarriage was no higher than the background rate of miscarriage in the United States and in other countries. What about menstrual periods? Well, many things can affect menstrual periods. I would not be surprised to hear a vaccine that gives you aching all over, fever, those other, temporary side effects. I would not be surprised to hear that they affect menstrual periods. Stress affects menstrual periods, changes to routine, weight loss and gain, fever, illness, even travel affects menstrual periods. So I'm not surprised that it might temporarily affect menstrual periods. There is no evidence that vaccine given to one woman will affect the cycles of other women around her. That's not a vaccine effect. There are studies that women who work together or live together, for example, in college dorms, tend to, for some unknown reason, tend to synchronize their cycles. That's not well understood. It's thought to have something to do with pheromones. What we do know is that vaccine stimulates the immune system. Stimulation can have other temporary effects, and that women who work or live closely together tend to synchronize their cycles. It's not well understood why that is. Or what about masks? Do masks really work? Well, I'm going to just give a couple of stories, give you a couple of examples. This was an older example. This was from the days before people were keeping distance and wearing masks. It really was not public practice at that time. There was a wedding reception that resulted in 30 cases. Those 30 cases, though, then went home. And those people who went home went to their local community and had secondary spread, 27 cases and 1 death. Those people who attended that reception that led to 177 secondary and tertiary transmitted cases. One of them worked at a long-term care facility. That spread like wildfire, and they had 38 cases, 6 deaths. Another worked at a correctional facility and ended up spreading to 82 cases within that correctional facilities. So here's an example of what can happen if you're not wearing masks and not keeping distance. Let's turn it around and tell a positive story. This is a story of 2 hairdressers who were working with clients. They had COVID-19 infection. They were contagious, but they didn't know it. They didn't have symptoms yet. But they had a policy that they wore masks, and they required all of their clients to wear masks as well. So 2 hairdressers spending at least 15 minutes with 139 clients. You know that they're within 6 feet, talking the entire time. The next day when they had symptoms, they tested positive, they contacted their clients, told them to get tested. Not a single person had a positive test. Evidence that masks do work. Delta does spread more easily, but the vaccines do work against the Delta virus. And as long as I'm on the subject of vaccines, I want to let everybody know, you can get your flu shot and your COVID-19 vaccine at the same time. Put them in different arms to reduce soreness in your arms, but you can literally get them on the same day. We have a little bit of time for questions. I'm including my email address here, kellydjm1@dhec.sc.gov. If we don't answer your question today, you're welcome to email me directly. And I will send these slides afterwards.
This sounds perfect. It really does. I know that in the questions that we had received ahead of time, I think Dr. Kelly has answered an awful lot of them, but she does have just a few minutes. So if you can raise your hand, and I mentioned how to do that, go down to the bottom of your screen where you see the emoji that says reactions. If you click on it, you'll see an option to raise your hand, and I will unmute you. Does that make any sense? So let's give it a test. How about Shanika, raise your hand. Okay, and I see, and I am asking her to unmute. There she went.
I'm unmuted.
And it worked. So by introduction, Shanika Pygott is our Deputy Chief Operating Officer. So I picked on her because at one point I tried to make her a co-host. So we're still learning on this, Dr. Kelly. I did note that we did have some questions around the Mu virus and what that was and what it meant, and should we all get in a tizzy?
Well, the Mu variant has several mutations, new mutations in its spike protein. And the concern is, does that mean that because it's got some new mutations, does that mean it can escape the immune response from vaccine? Will vaccine work against Mu? I'd like to point out that the vaccine produces antibody response, not to just like a single site on the spike protein. They're called epitopes. I'll put that word in the chat box, but that, when you make antibodies, it's not to just one site. It's not just sticking on one place on the spike protein. It sticks to multiple places. So it is possible that there'll be a weaker response to the Mu variant because, imagine if there's a change in the protein, the spike protein, so it's covering up some of those spots so that the antibody can't stick to it. It'll stick to other places. So there might be a weaker response, but what we've seen, we don't know that for sure yet. What we have seen, though, is Mu is not taking over from Delta. Delta spreads more easily, and that's what's been most important. I'm going to speak anthropomorphically, as though viruses have, thinks and wants. But if you think like a virus, which of course is a silly thing to say, but I think it's helpful to look at it this way. What does the virus want? The virus wants to make more copies of itself. It wants to spread to more people. It doesn't really want to kill people. It just wants to spread to more people. So the virus that's going to spread the most is the one that can spread the most, not the one that kills people. That's not very helpful to the virus. So Delta right now spreads the most and is out competing Mu.
I never thought I would say go Delta.
Well, no, we still want to vaccinate people so that if they get Delta, the worst case scenario would be that they get mild disease. But, vaccine does block transmission. You are much less likely to get infected if you are vaccinated. It's not 100%. There are some breakthrough cases, but you're also much less likely to get infected, much less likely to transmit it to others.
Rhonda, I see you've got your hand up, and there's also a couple of questions in the chat. I think there's a real quick answer, and then Rhonda, I'm going to come back to you. But Dr. Beaster wants to know, are there any other vaccines in the pipeline?
Oh, yes, definitely. So there's one called Novavax. Novavax is in the pipeline. I think they're still in phase 3 studies, and they have a completely different approach. They are not an mRNA vaccine. They're more like the traditional vaccine where you take just proteins and not deal with the messenger RNA. And it has some advantages in that it doesn't need to be kept super cold like the messenger RNA one, so it's a little bit easier to deliver. It is looking highly efficacious. It looks like it's working, looks like it's very safe, and maybe that would be preferred by some people who don't want a messenger RNA vaccine. On the other hand, it's months away. I mean, they haven't even finished their phase 3 studies, so I think it would be a shame if people were waiting for that. There's also work on a nasal spray vaccine. That would be ideal, because that would, how do you contract this virus? You contract it through your upper respiratory system. If there was a nasal spray vaccine, then you could fight it right at the source. The problem is it's challenging to make a vaccine like that, make it stable.
Rhonda, go ahead.
We were discussing earlier about the Johnson & Johnson. You said it was 85% with the first shot. What percentage would it be if you got the booster with it after the one shot?
So there are studies looking at that right now. So they're not published. So the only information I have is information direct from the company. So take, you always have to take it with a grain of salt. And it's not approved for a booster yet. So yeah, they have to look at the safety of this as well. So it's not approved. What I have learned from the company is that their data is looking like if you get the second shot, that increases that prevention up into more than 90%, 90 to 95%. So it puts it back in that same camp with the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. But again, that's not published and not approved yet. That's just what the company is telling me.
So,
Thank you.
there's a couple of, thank you, Rhonda. There's a couple of other questions. What effect does the vaccine have on lupus and atrial fibrillation?
So lupus is an autoimmune disease. There are a number of other autoimmune diseases: rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, sarcoid. They are all autoimmune diseases. And there was some concern that another one, multiple sclerosis, there was some concern, theoretical, that if you got vaccinated and had an autoimmune disease, that you might have a flare of your autoimmune disease. What we know so far is that studies done with people who have lupus and with multiple sclerosis, there has not been a flare of their disease. Those are the studies I know of. Now, when I say a flare of disease, now, of course, most people have achy all over, soreness at the site of the shot. And so that might include increasing achiness in your joints. It's not exactly an autoimmune flare. It's what everybody else is experiencing as well. There's no evidence that, that there are any disease conditions in which it is unsafe to get vaccinated. You can get vaccinated even if you have an autoimmune condition, even if you have renal failure and on dialysis, even if you have cancer chemotherapy. Now, however, if you do have an autoimmune condition and you're taking strong medications to fight that autoimmune condition, talk to your rheumatologist, talk to your doctor about what's the best timing for your vaccine. There is an American Academy of Rheumatology that has specific recommendations. So some people get IV medications every few weeks or 6 weeks. There are different regimens. Sometimes it's better to get vaccinated 2 weeks before you get treated, that sort of thing. So that's the sort of thing you need to talk about, the timing with your rheumatologist to get the best benefit. It's not that it's dangerous, it's to get the best immune benefit.
So I'm being very mindful of Dr. Kelly's time, but there's some questions here that I've heard from several other folks. Concerns about an increase in the false results, the false negatives, the false positive. Have y'all seen anything at DHEC in that regard?
One of the concerns we have is that if a sample is not taken adequately, you've got a false negative. I mean, if people are not, that they're too hesitant with the nasal swab, And, granted, you no longer need to do the long brain biopsy swabs. You can do an anterior nares, but you still need to get a good sample. Or if that sample is not handled correctly, if it's left in the car in the heat, it denatures, it falls, the proteins and the RNA fall apart. And so you're going to get a false negative test, even with PCR, because it was not treated well. You need to make sure that it's not left in a condition where it gets overheated. You need to make sure you get a good sample. Now, what about antigen tests versus PCR tests? Antigen tests are great because they're rapid tests. You get an answer right away. If they're positive, you're pretty sure that they are positive. I mean, again, there are weird things that can happen. You may have heard rumors about kids making a test turn positive by putting a drop of Coca-Cola on it rather than a nasal swab. Yeah, you can fake a positive test by changing the acid on the positive test, by mistreating the test. But a rapid test done correctly that is positive, you can be rest assured that that is positive, at least right now, while rates are so high. There's so much community transmission. What if it's negative? Unfortunately, this is the downside about antigen tests. They're not as sensitive. They will miss, on average, about 1 in 5 infections if the infection is really early on and you don't have a lot of virus up your nose. So if you've got someone who has symptoms and they have a negative antigen test, you can't hang your hat on it. You need to do the other test, the PCR test as well, because the PCR test actually multiplies the amount of virus in the swab. So it can look at it to find it earlier on. The downside of a PCR test is sometimes it'll stay positive even when you're no longer contagious, because it will multiply even dead virus particles, even virus particles that are not viable, that are not infectious. So quick summary, antigen, if it's positive, you can trust it. If it's negative and you got symptoms, need to do a PCR. Don't do a second PCR to prove that now somebody is negative and go back to work. Positive PCR, do your 10 days isolation. If your symptoms are better and you have no fever, you can go back out of isolation, back to work.
That is perfect. We've had an awful lot of confusion over that. I am watching the clock. This question is very interesting. If your first 2 doses of the vaccine were Moderna and you want to get the booster and it gets approved, would you need to get Moderna or does it matter?
Right now, the recommendation is sticking with the same dose of vaccine, but I am hoping that ACIP will weigh in on this, CDC will weigh in on this. So right now, the recommendation is sticking with the same dose of vaccine, but it's also possible that if you got Moderna, you might not need a booster. There are some studies now coming out showing that Moderna and Pfizer are very close to each other, but Moderna's dose of vaccine is a lot higher. That's 100 micrograms. Pfizer's was 30 micrograms. So it might be that Moderna really will last longer. So we're waiting to hear.
So there is a lot more questions popping up in the chat.
I can be a little bit late for my other meeting. Let's do them.
Okay. Is the flu vaccine going to have an effect on those who have had COVID vaccine?
It should not. You should not have. You should. It's a different vaccine. So I think that will be. I think it's important. It's a different virus. You don't want to get the flu. If you get the flu, number one, our hospitals are pretty busy. If you get the flu and get bad sick, or even just bad enough you want to go to the emergency room, those places are overcrowded right now. You don't want to have to do that. Number two, if you get the flu, it's going to lower your immunity. So you might be more likely to get other infections, such as COVID.
Oh, good point. A little bit more about the monoclonal antibody infusions. How does it affect the disease course?
So monoclonal antibodies are passive antibodies. They're temporary. What they'll do is that they will attack the virus sooner than it will augment, it will increase what your natural immune system is doing. And so they've been very important in decreasing the severity of disease. And there is some evidence that they can shorten the amount of time that you are sick by up to 4 days.
This is a very interesting question. So she says, after receiving the vaccine, I've noticed that I now have an allergy to grass. Is that normal? And she also has a post-nasal drip. That's
a tough one to answer. I can't, you can't figure out whether that is because of the vaccine or just a coincidence. I mean, it is true that the vaccine stimulates your immune system, so there may be some relationship there, but I can't say.
All right. Can you speak to any association of blood clots and the vaccine?
Yes, there have been 3 vaccine report associated deaths in the United States. There were 3 cases of people who had blood clots and low platelet counts. That's a very weird combination. Platelets help your blood to clot. So to have blood clots and low platelets is a really weird thing. It was an abnormal response to the J&J vaccine. But I'd like to point out that's, those 3 cases, that's tragic, but that was 3 cases out of at that time, more than 8 million doses of J&J vaccine that was given. But further studies, they've been able to identify who are people who are likely to have that abnormal blood clotting effect. And there's also now been investigation into what's the best way to treat it. So doctors around, they had put a stop to administering the J&J vaccine for a period of time. They took that time to educate doctors about what this is, how to treat it, how to recognize it, and to make sure that there weren't more cases than we thought so.
All
I see
right.
another question. Have there been any cases of the vaccine decreasing platelet counts just with this syndrome? So yes, it's rare, but yes, there have been some cases with this syndrome.
Okay. Well, all things COVID, Dr. Kelly, I can't thank you enough. Folks, if there are any unanswered questions, we will make sure that Dr. Kelly gets them. I am really so appreciative of her giving us her time today. And I know there is a lot of demand on her time. So thank you, Dr. Kelly.
These have
And,
been excellent questions. Thank you so much.